How has the world responded to Israel's continuing war on Gaza and the humanitarian catastrophe? Clearly, the UN Security Council failed in its duty to stop hostilities. This from a world body whose primary responsibility is to maintain international peace and security. Its inability to pass resolutions for a peace, a truce or humanitarian pause exposed the polarization among its members which paralyzed the Council. The United States was the principal stumbling block in efforts to achieve a ceasefire. Its unconditional support for Gaza handed Tel Aviv full freedom to continue its barbaric military campaign in utter disregard for world opinion. The Security Council's inaction led to an emergency session of the General Assembly which approved by an overwhelmingly majority a resolution calling for a truce. Only the United States and a handful of countries voted no. While this resolution has moral and political weight and aimed to mount diplomatic pressure on Israel and its backers, it is non-binding, therefore it cannot do nothing to end Israel's war on Gaza. These developments demonstrated America's increasing diplomatic isolation, as several of its allies joined most of the international community to back an immediate ceasefire. While some European countries shifted their focus to voice concern for humanitarian crisis and the loss of Palestinian lives, Washington refused to ask Israel to cease its bombardment or lift the siege of Gaza, showing indifference to the devastating humanitarian consequences of Israel's actions. UN officials repeatedly declared that Israeli violence directed at over 2 million Palestinians trapped in Gaza was collective punishment, but the United States and its Western partners only called out Hamas for the attack on Israel and accepted Israel's carpet bombing of an entire population as Israel's right to defend itself. They showed no compassion for thousands of Palestinian casualties who were portrayed as human shield for Hamas, an egregious example of dehumanizing Palestinians. President Joe Biden even questioned Palestinian casualty figures, saying that he had no confidence in the numbers the Palestinians are using. When Washington began to voice concern for the civilian deaths, it was too late especially as it continued to oppose a ceasefire. These developments laid the bare US-led West's hypocrisy. While Western leaders denounced Russian military actions and targeting of civilians in Ukraine, they refused to apply the same principle to Gaza. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen once characterized Russia's attacks on civilian infrastructure that aimed to deprive people of water and electricity as acts of pure terror. But neither she nor any Western leader chose to describe Israel's actions of cutting off electricity, water, food and fuel supplies to Gaza in a similar way. Nor did Israel's use of white phosphorus in indiscriminate artillery attacks urge Western governments to denounce this violation of international humanitarian law. There was no Western condemnation of Israel's attacks on Jabalia refugee camp, in which scores of people were killed and for which Tel Aviv claimed responsibility, justifying civilian deaths as tragedy of war. Public outrage over the humanitarian disaster is in sharp contrast to the position of the Western governments. Western countries who claim to be standard bearers of human rights and constantly lecture other countries on this adopted a deafening silence on Israeli atrocities and genocidal actions. This display of double standards was not new. Western concern for human rights has always been selective, its criticism usually directed at adversaries and opponents, while friendly countries have been shielded from censure. Germany and France imposed a ban on pro-Palestinian rallies in a bid to criminalize expressions of sympathy for Palestinians. This made a mockery of their democratic credentials and showed the shallowness of their commitment to freedom of expression. In the United States, donors threatened to cut off funding to universities where students rallied in solidarity with Palestinians. The Guardian reported that prominent American figures, from magazine editors to Hollywood agents, faced sacking or rebuke for supporting Palestinians. Elsewhere in Europe, pro-Palestinian activists were hounded on the pretext of being anti-Semitic. In the UK, Home Secretary Suella Braverman branded pro-Palestinian demonstrations as hate marches, called for curbs on protests, and urged criminalizing waving the Palestinian flag. All this in so-called democracies who claim civilizational superiority over countries of the global south. The Western media's role has been as one-sided as that of their governments and blind to the suffering of the Palestinian people. Major networks echoed Israeli propaganda and mostly covered the war from the prism of Israel's right to defend itself. Western TV anchors seemed to read from the same script and, disregarding massacres carried out by Israel, kept asking interviewees if they condemned Hamas. The most flagrant example of disinformation spread by the Western channel was of Israeli babies beheaded by Hamas, which had no basis in fact. Only when the scale of killings in Gaza could not be ignored and criticism of their bias mounted did networks such as BBC change course to cover these. Meanwhile, Western social media companies censored Palestinian content, as confirmed by the international human rights organizations including Amnesty. The response from the Muslim countries neither matched the catastrophic situation on the ground nor met the expectations of their own people. Other than diplomatic activism at the United Nations to secure a General Assembly resolution, it did not go beyond issuing denunciation of Israel. While several South American countries cut ties with Israel, only Jordan and Bahrain did so from among Arab states who had established diplomatic relations with Tel Aviv. Does this mean the Palestinians have been abandoned? Yes, because the international community failed to stop the carnage in Gaza. No, because across the world, from west to east, people came out in unprecedentedly large numbers to show solidarity with the Palestinians and demand a ceasefire. Public outrage over the humanitarian disaster expressed in protest rallies was in sharp contrast to the pusillanimous position adopted by their governments. Public opinion in the United States was also at sharp variance with the Biden administration's stance. A Data for Progress poll found 66% of American voters supported a ceasefire. The consequences of the biggest disaster to befall the Palestinian people since 1948 will be far-reaching from the region and for the world.